It's time for a courageous conversation. Today's topic, how does social justice and spirituality intersect? And so today we're bringing some courage. We're bringing Emmy to the conversation. And this is an opportunity for us as yogis to start considering how we take our practice that we do on the mat, off the mat, and into the world. And so I was excited to talk with Emmy today. We met over Facebook because I saw a workshop that you were doing, Emmy, and I was really fascinated by the topic. And so I thought this would be a really interesting piece of content for everybody here on YouTube land to participate in, and for you to share your wisdom, your knowledge, your experience. And I was even more excited to learn that you already had practiced Kundalini yoga, and you've been doing that for a long time, since you were young. So we have lots of places where we can explore this conversation. So welcome, Emmy.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here and to be connecting with you. It's been so nourishing and uplifting having these conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that we're at a time now where we get to look at yoga differently. In some ways we have to look at it differently, and in other ways now we start to choose. And part of that is understanding the cultural context that it comes from, the historical background, and then how we can use and leverage this infinite ancient knowledge to move ourselves forward. And so I'm super excited by this. So let's start in the beginning. Tell us a little bit, share us with us a little bit your exposure to Kundalini yoga.
Well, so I was very lucky to be raised by a mom and a grandma and the rest of my family that originates in North India. So I grew up with yoga, just part of my upbringing. It was very normal. It was very, something that my grandma started talking about when I was a very young child. She had all these yoga books. And when I was maybe like 7 or 8, my brother and I would just look at these books and imitate the poses. And she would talk about spirituality and Sikhism, because my family is Sikh or Sikh. It was just part of my life. It was very ordinary. And so from the age of 11, my mom, my grandma, and I would go to the local Gurdwara where there was a Kundalini yoga class. It was open to everybody. And I think it was like $10 by donation a month if you wanted to pay. And it was this beautiful sacred space, this giant, room of like 60, mostly women. Maybe there was like 5 men from all different backgrounds, all different, walks of life. And we would do Kundalini yoga twice a week. And so I grew up doing that from the age of 11. I was the only kid in that room. And I was very lucky to have this sense of collective consciousness, and I was deeply grateful for the healing space of my mat. Sometimes my mom and my grandma we'd go to yoga like fighting and arguing, and we'd come back just feeling so much connection and peace, and the arguments were just not important anymore. So yoga was just part of my life. It was how I was raised. In addition to Kundalini, I grew up doing restorative yoga on the weekends with my mom in a community center. So I really have my family to thank for how Kundalini yoga came into my life and how yoga in general came into my life.
Yeah. And how do you feel that Kundalini yoga relates to Sikhism?
It's a really big question. And, I definitely have to say the caveat that this is just my perspective. It definitely does not represent the views of all Sikh people or, Indian people. But, it was for me a very interesting interpretation of the faith that I was raised in, because it was through the lens of, where Kundalini emerged from, which was, the counterculture and YogaVision and the US. And, my grandma knew from the beginning that there was, these rumors about YogaVision being a little bit not a great person, like kind of a con man, like she was really open about that. Yeah. She was like, yeah, he wasn't a perfect human by any means. And, she also had like these rumors that she would tell me about, Kundalini yoga being for, in some ways for politicians' children in the 60s and 70s, for a way for them to get high naturally without, turning to drugs. And that kind of political aspect of it, she was a very politically minded woman, my grandma, in addition to being like an amazing healer. So she was always like very skeptical of the where Kundalini emerged from, but she was a devout Sikh woman. So to be able to do our mantras and be in our sacred space and to move the body in a way that felt really strong and powerful, and to get the energy moving through the body was just a positive thing. So in my opinion, the words, the sound healing, the mantras, the gurmukhi, the beauty of the sound is really a huge connection, I think, between Sikhism and Kundalini yoga. The music, always was a highlight for me. It really touched me in a deep ancestral place. And I think that sound healing is embedded in the mantras, in the chanting. So that's one connection. Beyond that, I personally did not do a Kundalini teacher training. So I was just experiencing the classes through the lens of really beautiful teachers that would come to the temple and teach. So I don't know much more about the philosophy that's taught in Kundalini or some of the more ideological things. For me, it was really about the spinal movements, the awakening of energy in the body, and these mantras and the breath. That was really the simple way that Kundalini connected to Sikhism for me.
Absolutely. So I hear you. And I think that part of it is understanding where pieces are inspired, where they're drawn from. And you're right that we, now exploring yoga in the West has a whole other context to it. So I think you're right. There's every one of us has an opinion about where that comes from and how we relate to it. And I think this is a good jumping off place into all the other topics that we're going to discuss today. So you were inspired by what you explored on the mat, having a sense of consciousness, feeling connected to your mom and your grandma, and then tell us about your journey from there into yoga itself and your teacher training.
Yeah, so I was very lucky to have, as an adolescent, the healing powers of yoga really grounded me, through all the dramas of being a teenager. It was so helpful. And I left home at 17 to study at a really unique school called Pearson College on Vancouver Island. And everyone was from different countries. It was full scholarship school, so everyone was there for free. And I continued to practice yoga there. And it was there that I think it's the first time I really felt proud to be Indian. Before that, I was living, in Burnaby, which is a fairly multicultural place, but I grew up with these two lives. I would have my Indian life with my extended family where we wore our traditional clothing and we spoke, I grew up listening to Punjabi and eating Punjabi food. And then I would go to school and I would feel really Western and really, just white, for lack of a better term. So going to that school really instilled this sense of pride about my ethnicity and my heritage that I hadn't felt before. And that was, I think, because there were other Indian people there that were really connected to their roots. So that was kind of the beginning of, thinking about sharing the ancestral practice. For me, it had always been a personal thing up until then. So I left that school, I went to university, and I did my teacher training in 2012 in Hatha yoga at the Vancouver School of Bodywork and Massage. It's now known as the Vancouver School of Healing Arts. And I was the youngest person in that training, but I was also I was probably the least flexible. It was me and the oldest person that training that would like feel really good together, because we weren't able to pop into a handstand or, do the full splits or any of that. I grew up doing Kundalini, which is not focused on these acrobatic, asanas. So it was really jarring. And, the teacher training was great. There was a lot of beautiful wisdom in it. It was led by a white man. There was some other teachers that were white, but I think maybe we had a very short Sanskrit lesson from two Indian women, and that was about it. And I just remember feeling a bit like, this is something's uncomfortable here. And I couldn't put my finger on it, because at that point, this consciousness around race and anti-racism wasn't present back in 2012. And yeah, from there, I continued to learn. I was really interested in trauma sensitive yoga, healing through mental health issues through yoga. I did a lot of teen yoga and pre and postnatal training, and for a long time taught in corporations after graduating from university. So yeah, I've taught in a few different countries. I've taught in lots of different contexts, but I think for me, yoga continues to just be a way for me to remember my roots, remember my family, and come back to my soul, so.
I really feel that connection between where we are now and the hand that's stretched out behind, connecting to previous generations and our ancestry, and then also looking at how yoga represents that. It is that living bond between where we've come from and now where we're heading to. And so with all your training, what has been most standout for you in terms of now what you want to launch the teachings into?
Yeah, well, I guess everything in my work changed in 2020 with the pandemic, because the corporations that I was working for, the businesses that I was teaching for, they all stopped coming to the office. And I did teach online for a year, and slowly I started to really feel disillusioned by the corporate mindset, by all of this kind of growth orientation. That there was a part of me that just really wanted to live differently and more in balance. And so I moved out of the corporate space, and I started thinking about, well, George Floyd's murder was really, really hit me in a deep place, and suddenly all of these conversations around race were starting to emerge. And my academic background is in cultural studies, so I grew up, well, I mean, I did my degree in looking at power and privilege and Marxism, and looking at like all of these systems of oppression, and I'd gone through this, like, understanding these forces. And suddenly with the Me Too movement, I also minored in gender and women's studies, so the Me Too movement and the racial consciousness that was rising in 2020, it was really groundbreaking. Like when you think about how much was dissolving in that year, for me, it changed my whole life. And suddenly there was an appetite, there was an openness, there was a door to having conversations about honoring the roots of yoga, and the fact that there were very few Indian teachers that were given opportunities in Vancouver or that were highlighted in international festivals. And this experience of being an Indian person in the diaspora, how much racism there is and was in the yoga industry. And I had been living with that for 10 years. I had known that existed, and I'd experienced it firsthand, but I had never had an opportunity to talk about it. And so a really good friend of mine who is of European descent, and, a yoga teacher and Ayurvedic practitioner in the States, she's like, Emmy, like, I'd love to support you in running a workshop on this. And, she's an amazing ally. And I had also been doing Indigenous allyship trainings around the same time with my Indigenous friends here on Coast Salish land. And they were really encouraging me to have this conversation around cultural appropriation and, what does it mean to respect yoga? And, they were really supportive. So with those two people in my life encouraging me, I started doing these workshops, and, they started off pretty simple, and then there was more interest in having a component of yoga teacher trainings that were about honoring the roots, and more people started opening up to this concept of looking at these difficult, courageous topics. So that's kind of where my work has taken me.
Okay. And that's exactly how you and I met. I've been running teacher training, and I've noticed, to mirror what you've said, that over time, and in particular since 2020, a lot more emphasis and focus and curiosity and willingness to step into courageous conversations about what don't I know, and where does it actually come from, and what have I been fed, or what have I believed to be true about the roots of yoga. And I think that those are places where we need to come together in order to support each other in our learning, no matter where we are on the spectrum of having done our history of where all about India and how it's been affected by colonization, and then all of us here living in the West, considering our power and our privilege, and then also thinking about where we can use yoga to develop a little bit more insight, knowledge, consciousness. So these workshops that you run, I'm definitely bringing you into our teacher training program, but all of that sparked something interesting in me, which is, how do we reach into our ancestral roots to have that conversation? Not just here on this level, but how do we all as practitioners understand that we have a role to play and to allow ourselves to be open to that conversation? So share with us a little bit your perspective there.
Oh, it's a great question. And I want to really acknowledge that there are uncomfortable moments, when talking about this, because I think that trauma of oppression, war, genocide, colonization, racism, they live in our DNA. We are coming out of a time of immense violence. All you have to do is look at the 20th century and see the madness that has happened on this earth because of people's divisions and systems of oppression that have subjugated certain groups. And on a soul level, I love how you brought that in some of our conversations, was looking at the soul's perspective of all of these social issues. Sometimes I find that in the spiritual world or in the yoga world, it's really easy to bypass. It's really easy to say, hey, well, we're all the same. We all look, under the skin, we're all the same, and we're all connected to God and we're all one. And on one dimension, that's true. But the truth is that my experience walking through the world with a darker colored skin and comparing it to the experience of my friend who doesn't have those same barriers because she's white, those are very real lived experiences that have very real consequences on people's lives. And, just looking at the demographics of BIPOC people and their experiences of health or their experiences of, higher rates of incarceration or police violence, these are real things that affect people every single day. And, going back to Sikhi and Sikhism, that sense of social justice is very embedded in the religious teachings that my family was raised in, that sense of, fighting for social justice and equality. And so, I think these conversations are a way to take yoga and make it something that's engaged spirituality, something that is lived change on the ground, which is the highest form, in my opinion, of why we do this. We're not living in a time where we need more hermits in mountains. We're living in a time of climate change and, racial violence and war and disease. And we need to be supporting each other in a new way, in a community way. And the only way to heal those wounds of the past is to look at them and heal them together and have the sense of, like, I say in some of my workshops, 200 years ago, we could not be sitting in the same room having this conversation without either, it just wouldn't happen. There would be a lot of, explicit power dynamics. Racism. There'd be this conversation wouldn't happen. And so to be able to sit with people of all different backgrounds and talk about the ways that they're impacted by these systems of power, because colonialism hurts the colonizer as well as the oppressed. It's not about who is hurt more or this victim mentality. It's about the system, the overall system of our history was pitting people against each other. And that's what we can't take forward with us. So I think it is an eye-opening conversation. It can be disturbing at times to look back and say, wow, I can't believe that yoga was banned in India for hundreds of years, where Indian people were not allowed to practice their own spiritual traditions. Temple dancing was banned, or the ways that aspects of India were extracted and commodified. The fact that India before colonization by the British was 25% of the world's economy, and after the British left, it was 3% of the world's economy. The levels of trauma from the partition, like there's so many layers that Indian people are living with. And I think one of the biggest ones for me was the sense of internalized inferiority, that just because I was Indian, I was not as good as a white person. And what I think a lot of people are unconsciously striving for is, European values of being a doctor, a teacher, engineer, um, it lives in a very deep way, and learning to unlearn that conditioning and really value my own ancestry has been so healing. So it's healing for me, and I think for others, it's a conversation that doesn't get had, or hasn't been had in a long time.
Right. So I so hear you and feel you, and I just want to add here that part of all of our education systems, particularly in the West, have been established by originally by British colonizers, and that's true of India, that's true of Canada, that's true of many places in the US. And the history of that even is wrapped around how to behave more like a European person. So the
Yes.
education system in all of these places have been engineered to have us model ourselves after an entity that isn't us. And so we have all those gaps in terms of how we see ourselves, how society sees who we are, and what we strive for internally. So
Yeah, exactly. And
complicated.
it's so complicated, and it's so entrenched, right? Like, not only was it the history book writers that were white men, but it is the governments, it is the psychology, even, like, the people that created psychology is based on a Western perspective, and the people that own the media, or it's so deep, the way that power operates, and it's so invisible until you start unpacking it, and you're like, oh my gosh, whose voices are we not hearing? Who's not represented here? And why do we give authority and expertise automatically to these white men, or to men, or to this type of person? And I think occupying what you might call marginalized identities, like being a woman, or being a BIPOC person, or being, any type of not majority identity. I think the reason that my soul chose that in this lifetime was to stand for oneness, and to bring awareness to the voices that were not being heard. And in my degree, we talked about this thing called privilege of the margins, which is when you are marginalized, you can see the system and how it operates, because you're outside of that circle of dominance. You can see the ways the power is operating, and you can choose to engage and resist that or change that. So for me, it's been a lot of releasing anger about not being taken seriously, or feeling frustration, and learning to move through those emotions, to come to a heart-centered place and realize that I do have power, and that this is an amazing time to have these conversations that are not about making people wrong, or like cancel culture or anything like that. That's not what it's about. It's about intergenerational healing, and highlighting those voices that have been silenced for a long time.
Yes, I love it. And I think this goes back to a very elementary thing I learned during my teacher training, is that you can do a perfect asana on the mat, and if you're an asshole off the mat, nobody cares. Like,
Yes.
it's not a representation of what we were actually trying to do. It's not about the
Yes.
perfect pose. It's about, how do we show up with consciousness? How do we evolve our ability and willingness to hear things that are uncomfortable, and then override the nervous system that just says, stop, don't do that, cut it out. And I think here there's an opportunity, right? That is that if we see someone else as the villain, then we are naturally the victims. I mean, that's the dichotomy, and that's the binary. And so a place of victory for all of us is coming to the truth, coming
Yes.
to a place where we're actually honest about, yeah, that happened. And there's something in me right here that wants peace out of it. And the only way to get peace is to do some healing and some heavy listening around where it was not peaceful.
Yes, 100%. And I think that is the crux of it. The truth heals, being able to be witnessed and heard, and also to hear and to listen. that's all we all need. I mean, that's what dissolves those DNA patterns of trauma, is to feel safe in our nervous system with people who may in the past have harmed our ancestors or have been the ones doing the harming. Like it's so deep. And I think that we all have our individual connections to that, you know, depending on our ancestry. But I really think that in one part of life, most people feel oppressed, at least in one part of their life. And so taking that intersectional view of like, we're not just our race, we're not just our gender identity, we're all of those things. We're a beautiful map of all of those things. And what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where women are consistently paid less, or, you know, sexualized in the workplace, or, you know, Black men are killed by police way too frequently? And like, do we want to live with that? And I think as a collective, our consciousness has got to a point where we're like, no, and we need to move forward into something different. And that means we need to come together to realize we have a problem.
Right. Right. And it really isn't about saving what has already been put into place, but rather to allow it to crumble. And part of the crumbling pieces is to remove foundations and to allow the natural experience of gravity to let it give way, like give way to what is being created. And I think that has everything to do with Kundalini rising, the divine feminine moving forward, the inside of us that says no more, we cannot.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to give our children and our children's children the next opportunities that we didn't have, is to clear the way.
Absolutely.
I love the work that you're doing. I think it's really positive, powerful, impactful. And where would people find you? Actually, let me do this for you. I'll drop all your contact information below this video so that people know how to reach out to you.
Yeah.
And then final thoughts about where your work is going in terms of opening up this conversation and this dialogue. And thank you also for being brave and willing to sit with your own knowingness in order to facilitate conversations for others. I think it's beautiful work and hard work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been an honor and a pleasure to be able to live in a time where I can have these conversations that women before me couldn't. You know, even in my family, my dad, you know, has his own company, and for a long time, my mom never told me this, but when my dad would go out for dinners with his managing team, and there was, you know, a white man who was one of his managers, people at the restaurant or at the event would automatically assume that the white man was the president of the company, you know, and they would just look to him, you know, to pay the bill or to do the president stuff. And for a long time, my mom didn't correct them. No, my dad didn't correct them either. They just let that assumption be there because they lived in an incredibly racially charged time in England in the 70s, you know, and they grew up with just very, very survival mode. My dad was, you know, mugged, and my mom had people spray paint, you know, slurs on her house. So they, until recently, didn't speak up. And I think I live in a time where I'm so privileged to be able to speak up and not fear my life, or, you know, not be hurt in the process of doing that. And so, yeah, I think that these conversations are about imagining a world where we don't have these same barriers, and imagining a world where everyone is reclaiming and deepening their connection to their ancestral gifts. You know, I always encourage people to reconnect to their own spiritual practices that their ancestors would have done, whether that's, you know, earth-based practices, medicinal practices, even like food and music, but to really reconnect to where you come from in your bones, because that part of us is very much like real and alive. And as much as we want to bypass that and forget the past, it's going to subconsciously continue until we bring it to consciousness and reclaim our ancestry. And I believe every culture in the world has a form of embodiment, has a form of earth-based practices. You might have to go back a ways, but we all have those medicines that our ancestors are encouraging us to remember at this time, because going forward into the future, that ancestral wisdom and and honoring everyone's ancestral gifts, I think is part of our healing. And, moving into a modern life, but with ancient wisdom, is what I want for my children. I want them to be, enriched by so many different traditions, but not stealing them, not extracting other cultures, not profiting, in a disrespectful way of other cultures. And we look at all the wars that have been had along racial lines or cultural lines. The solution is to have a respectful, honoring relationship that is through dialogue and, being able to grapple with these issues. That's how we stop the pattern of war, is through dialogue and respect. So yeah, I think this work is like, because I want future generations to not have the barriers that I experienced, that my mom experienced, that my grandmother experienced, and for people to be seen as whole beings that have gifts to share, and to respect and honor those gifts if they've been passed down through your lineage or not, So yeah, that's what keeps me going. And, in terms of this work, I love teaching for yoga teacher trainings and, holding different workshops and studios. And I'm really heartened to see this, this group of studios that are really having those difficult questions and conversations and striving to be more inclusive and equitable. And I think they're still like the leading edge. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But slowly the awareness is spreading. And what I'm really excited by are all the South Asian teachers that are finally getting their voice heard, whether it's ABCD Yogi on Instagram, or the Yoga is Dead podcast, or, lots of other amazing South Asian teachers like Callie Scoot, who does Rebel Yoga Tribe in the UK. There's this like reclaiming and healing of colonization in the way that South Asian people are coming back to their roots to share it. Yeah.
So exciting. I want to end with the final 5, and these are questions that I have for you, and I think our viewers would love to know, and as quick as you can, but I'm not mad at you if you take a little longer to answer, okay?
I'll be quick.
Yeah. First question, your best advice you've ever received?
Oh gosh. That's a great one. Someone told me once, your imperfections make you perfect. And it's not necessarily advice, but embracing the imperfections of life has been great. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. Your favorite moment in a yoga class?
Oh, wow. I think it's just when in my Kundalini classes in my adolescence, we would do a healing circle, and everyone would either hold a space on the outside or come in the inside and receive the healing intentions of the group. That really stays with me. Yeah.
Okay. I've been part of those. They're amazing. They're beautiful.
They are amazing. Yeah.
A mantra that you love?
I love so many mantras. Lately, I've been really going back to Ramadasa for the healing power of that one. And I love the Gayatri mantra as well. It's really resonates deeply in my bones.
Yeah, I agree. An important book that you've read?
Oh, there's been so many. Oh gosh. I think a lot of books by Paulo Coelho have really stayed with me. Like, something about his writing is, it like takes you on a spiritual adventure. But I think when I read A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle, it really changed my life in a huge way. I was 16 when I read that, and it was like I was going through major mental health issues, and A New Earth just really awoken me to a new consciousness. So Eckhart Tolle's work was also very powerful.
The Alchemist, I will agree, Paulo Coelho.
Yeah.
I've read it a number of times. It's on the reading list for Kundalini yoga teacher training.
Amazing.
For that very idea, like, I think that I even read that he just sat down and wrote it. It was an endeavored process, like not a labored process, but rather, here's the story. And every time I've read it, I picked up something new. And in particular, that journey, when I first read it, when I was a younger person, was very short. It seemed very short to me. And then when I read it later on in my life, it was like, oh, he started off as a teenager, like a young person, and then ended like, you know, a wizened older person. And I missed that the first time I read it. So, you know, you're right. A
Wow.
good book will keep feeding you over your life.
Definitely. Yeah.
And then final one, what do you do? What's your favorite pastime with your leisure time? What would you, if you had an open 2 hours, what would you do?
Oh, I would probably go to the beach and walk and take my journal and listen to music. Yeah, I think
Ah,
being in
yes.
nature, being
Yes.
in nature and writing in nature is medicine, and you know, walking with loved ones too in nature is great. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for this courageous conversation, for taking some time out for us. We'll see Emmy again in the Kundalini Yoga Teacher Training Program that is part of YogaVision. And I'm sure your work is going to go far and wide. So all the best as you start to spread this message of hope and peace and courage in ways that we can't even imagine right now.
Thank you so much, Salimah. It's been
Yeah.
so inspiring talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the open door. Until next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
My name is Salimah, yoga therapist. You've been listening to Emmy on YogaVision Online. Brave Conversations. See you on the next time.